One young woman infected 5 relatives without ever showing symptoms. So this is getting very serious, folks. So again, here's the chart of China with the December 26, 2019 eclipse in the inner wheel, and additionally the 2020, June 21st, 2020 solar eclipse. Note how, again, they're directly opposite of each other, making a double whammy hit on the Chinese natal Uranus. Note the eclipse paths. Here is the eclipse path for the December 2019 eclipse. And this eclipse path is the eclipse path for June 21st, 2020. Notice how they're crisscrossing over each other. Notice the outbreaks. Right now we're seeing the outbreaks move along into India, into the Middle East, in Iran. Let's go back here. There you go. So you're seeing it perfectly play out. And I believe a few weeks back, I did say it would be this area, particularly of Asia and this part of Central Asia and the Middle East, that would be greatly impacted as the virus moves from the Wuhan area and directly moving west. So moving west of China. So the both eclipses made a direct hit on China's natal Uranus, as I stated earlier. And these are mundane testimonies that, again, fortify that unexpected developments and surprises that will cause a dramatic and drastic change in China's social structure, its financial systems, and make a direct hit on its political base of power, causing much needed radical changes within the country. So again, with Uranus involved with these eclipse cycles that are now active, we can expect a greater degree of uncertainty, greater unreliability, higher unpredictability with what we hear coming out of China, not only in terms of its economic data, not only in terms of the virus data, but in terms of where it stands on issues. So we will see a beginning of a political breakdown occur within China that correlates very close to what's happening with the Chinese economy. Now, futurist and economic researcher who holds a PhD in toxicology from Duke University, Chris Martenson, has a very unique perspective about the coronavirus and what its effects will be to the global economy. This is important because, as we know, China is the second largest economy in the world, the second largest economy in the world. And anything that's affecting China, especially with production that affects supply chains, is going to have a massive impact on both Europe and the United States. According to Chris Martenson, who has a PhD in toxicology and is also an economic forecaster, he doesn't believe what the mainstream media, the Chinese mainstream media, is saying and what the American and European mainstream media is parroting. According to him, things are not getting better. And according to Martenson, quote, "It's getting worse." And it's essentially a tale of two stories inside of China and outside of China. Inside of China, there's been tremendous suspicion of the reporting. And it's very clear when we look at the data and we go back, they have been underreporting the cases at least by a factor of 10 or maybe more. Martenson believes that this underreporting correlates with both infections and deaths. And the Chinese government, according to Martenson, this is an important point that I feel that correlates very well with what we've been talking about with the Saturn Pluto, is that the Chinese government would not lock down 90% of its economy just to save a couple thousand lives. They don't roll that way. That's not the way China operates. So there is something that is very worrisome to them. And it's worrisome enough where they are willing to do things even if it actually creates a possible economic implosion. So what China is essentially going through, from what we can see, and I agree with what Chris Martenson is saying, is an existential crisis, an existential threat, an existential crisis. Now, that's the story inside of China. Outside of China, we can trust the numbers a lot more. So when we're looking outside of China, in terms of nation states that have been impacted by the coronavirus, we're seeing the cases that are now exploding exponentially. So the cases outside of China, in terms of people getting infected, are exploding exponentially. And it's got a very short doubling time and a very high rate of infectability. So people who are getting infected. So it's not the flu, it's not SARS. The mainstream media, the astrologers, the mainstream astrologers, I should say, are trying to tell everyone there's nothing to worry about. And that's not the view that I take. So I think we can agree that the coronavirus is a real problem. It's a real beast. And it's already weakening China's economy. Now, you got to remember, China's economy was slowing down and weakening. And now it's set to take another significant blow as the spread of the coronavirus outbreak is disrupting travel, production. It's causing massive transit disruptions and massive long-term consequences. So we're seeing consequences in terms of the disruption in industry, manufacturing, commercial output, supply chains, particularly with supply chains. And at this point, the economic impact of the coronavirus appears mostly now confined to China, but the outbreak is still unsettling global markets. So these global markets are starting to unwind slowly because the outbreak is growing exponentially. The coronavirus is spreading much faster than SARS. And if it's not contained, it threatens to become a global pandemic. What do we know? 50,000 cases a day in China at this rate. Infections are doubling every 5 days. The first phase is likely to peak in the virus in April. The epidemic peak is still months away. It will be very hard to control this epidemic in the same way we did with SARS 15 to 20 years ago. Cases are always underestimated. Death delays are as long as 3 weeks. Reported deaths outside of China are not reassuring because of delays, and we still don't know the full effects of this virus. In fact, a lot of that information is being withheld by China. Researchers, a study of 52 critically ill adults in Wuhan Jinyintan Hospital found that 61.5% of patients requiring hospitalization and intense monitoring ended up becoming non-survivors. So it essentially concluded that the virus, the coronavirus, is more lethal for vulnerable patients than SARS or MERS was. And the mean age of the 52 patients who participated in the study were 59 years old. 67% were men, 40% were women who had been diagnosed with some kind of chronic illness. Researchers are finding that people who are diagnosed with severe pneumonia, who are coronavirus patients. Now, let's talk about the different waves. So if we examine history of previous pandemics and the spread of the contagious of viruses, we reach some very interesting conclusions that we have a first wave, right, where the virus leaps to humans, which happened in late October and early November. Again, that correlated with the culmination of the Saturn-Pluto. Then we see the initial spread. We see the officials suppress the warnings as rumors. Then we see unrestricted travel spreading the virus to others, plausible deniability, right? We see this phase, the end of phase 1 and the beginning of a phase 2 period, which happens around here, where the virus spreads within China and to the world, where travel is late. Then we have a phase 3 that happens around here, where the world finally awakens to the pandemic, the global economy slides into depression, and wave 3 outbreak. So we have wave 1, wave 2, I would say wave 2 is right about here, and wave 3 is here. Okay, so we look at the eclipse as our timing factor, and we use the black box forecast of the coronavirus. So this based on the chart, based on the horoscope of the coronavirus, when it was sanctioned as a pandemic virus with this title, COVID-19, by the World Health Organization. This is what the black box indicated in terms of, now this is not exclusive to China, but we do know most of the deaths will occur in China and further west into India and the Middle East. So this is like wave 1, right? We're just finishing this wave 1. Wave 2, right? When the virus is likely to peak, wave 2. And then we have a wave 3 later this year. So the prospects of it going to a global pandemic, a true global pandemic, where it can infect up to 65 million people worldwide. So let's say approximately 60 million in China, 5 million worldwide, could occur in the third and fourth quarter of 2020. Actually, you could look at it this way. You could say we're finishing up the first wave now. By early March, we're going to go into the second wave around the time of the triple alignment. And then we're going to go into a third wave around the time, around late, let's say by late August, early September, we go into this third wave. And then we begin to see it subside later in the year by early 2021. So this is the prospect of a global pandemic is still there. The rise and peak in deaths will likely occur in China between April and May, or I should say April and June of this year. So the bigger issue, believe it or not, is not just the deaths. It has to do with the fact that China is facing financial Armageddon with 85% of its businesses set to run out of cash in 3 months. 85% of the businesses that make up the world's second largest economy in the world. Now, you have to understand, if you combine the economy of England, Italy, Germany, Spain, Russia combined, still does not equal the size of the Chinese economy. Now, just imagine for a moment that just Europe, went through a Great Depression. Now, that would have a significant impact. But if the United States and China were not to go into a recession or a depression, the world would still hum on. In other words, it would be very regional. However, if China goes into a depression, the rest of the world will go into a depression, and the United States will likely go into a recession. So China has essentially grounded to a halt. Indicators confirm the worst case scenario. China is disintegrating. Its steel demand, its property sales, and traffic are all approaching zero. Terrifying charts shown here show China's economy remains completely paralyzed. So the other thing we need to factor in is China is the largest exporting nation in the world, and China's shipping nears a standstill amid the coronavirus disruption. So container ships are leaving Chinese ports as little as 10% full. So at some point, sooner or later, we are going to see massive supply chains disruption that no matter how much money printing the US Federal Reserve does or the global banks do, will not make up for the fact that there are not sufficient goods and services that can be rendered when supply chains are disrupted completely and there is nothing to ship out. There's nothing to purchase. And we're seeing the fact that when these supply chains get disrupted, it not only impacts industrial production in China, it takes a deeper toll on industrial production outside of China because many of those supply chains of materials and other components are necessary for outside production, particularly in Europe and to a large degree the United States. So China is facing financial Armageddon with 85% of businesses set to run out of cash in 3 months. So, if you look at Chinese businesses, the state-owned businesses, the large corporations will likely have enough liquidity injected into them to last another 2 or possibly 3 quarters. So they're good at least into the fall. It's the country's smaller businesses that are facing a head-on collision with an iceberg that's going to sink the Chinese Titanic economy because these businesses, 85% of these businesses employ over 80% of China's population. And these businesses are expected to run out of cash within a month. And should this happen, not only will China's economy collapse, but China's 40 trillion financial system will disintegrate as it suddenly is flooded with trillions of bad loans being called. So again, many factories right now and other businesses remain completely stalled due to the virus. And many owners have no other choice but just simply to pray and hope that things will return to normal before they all careen off a financial cliff. But actually, maybe I was correct. I think we're going to have a financial eclipse and it's going to start in China. It's going to hit Europe. It's already hitting India. It's not just in China. The longer the epidemic lasts, the larger the cash gap drain will be. And it's likely we're going to see China inject tremendous amount of liquidity into the system by the time of the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction on April 1st. The question, of course, will it be enough? Will it be effective? And what we're likely to see is they will inject that. They will do massive monetary liquidity injections just to prevent trillions of dollars of bad loans and prevent credit default swaps mechanisms kicking in place when businesses start to fall or collapse on maintaining their loans. Remember, most of these small businesses operate by getting money on loans. If all those loans go belly up, we're talking about a crisis bigger than what happened in 2008. So, we're talking about millions of companies across the country are in a race against the clock to stay afloat. And the irony, of course, is that this is all happening even as China has, in fact, dramatically in recent weeks cut their rates, engaged in a barrage of mini stimulus measures, injecting massive amounts of liquidity to cutting taxes, to supporting virus-stricken companies, to flooding the economy with a record $5 trillion in loans and shadow debt in the last month. So it's looking like that China is going to have a last hurrah moment to save their economy. Things are going to get very dire. And the question is, with this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction on its natal Jupiter, while Mars is crossing over the ascendant and the Sun is in the second house, and Uranus in the second house of its financial system and general economy, will this massive stimulus program, in other words, will there be enough effective intervention? I would say that it may be very similar to what happened leading up to the collapse in 2008, where the Federal Reserve injected somewhere about $16 trillion from December 12, 2007 through March 24, 2008. $16 trillion was injected into the system, and still we had a global financial crisis. So they injected trillions into the system. Nobody knew it. Nobody knew about this. This is all reported. This is all a fact. You can look this up. And we still had a crisis. So I think the same thing is playing out now. They're injecting trillions, and it's not going to make one damn bit of a difference. Why? Because look, I look at the black box. This is probably around the time they're going to inject a lot of money in the system, and then it collapses anyway. And it's just a little too late because the dominoes are already falling. The China shutdown is crushing India's already crumbling economy. Look what's happening in India. Now, the Indian economy is bigger than England's. I think it's bigger than Spain's and England and France's combined. It's very big. So we're seeing supply chain shock emanating from China to other Pacific countries in Europe. That is becoming a major headache, particularly for India. And India's pharmaceutical industry relies heavily on imports from China. So even before this coronavirus hit, India's economy was rapidly deteriorating into an economic crisis, where the former Indian finance minister, Sinhara, warned several months ago that the country is in a very deep crisis, witnessing a death of demand. There's no driver in the economy. There's no demand. And the government is befooling the people with its economic distortions of how growth is around the corner. So it was already crumbling. And now we have major supply disruptions. And according to many economists inside of India, if the disruptions that are causing the shortages are not replenished in the next couple of weeks, we could see India go from a recession into a depression. Of course, none of this is going to affect us, right? Because your financial advisor, right, who knows everything, he would have told you this by now. Well, how bad economically will COVID-19 virus get? Well, we could see, based on these projections, the estimated impact of GDP expected between now and 2020, South Korea getting hit the hardest, Hong Kong, followed by Thailand, Malaysia, Japan. And what I did here is I did a multi-box analysis, looked at the sum activity of when the period would culminate. Again, you could see April being the reddest here, Hong Kong getting hit the hardest. That certainly makes sense. But you could see other nations getting hit particularly hard, like Singapore, South Korea, Singapore, Philippines. What else seems to be getting hit? New Zealand, Mexico, even the United States, quite a bit. The United Kingdom, of course, Argentina, and Turkey. So just zero in at the sum area here and see which nations have the reddest, indicating they're going to be more impacted from the supply chain disruptions. So it's only really a matter of time before production lines are halted in the US and in all of these countries, because the sourcing of Chinese parts is offline. All units and parts, even the parts and mechanisms required for the fracking industry in the United States, which produces more oil than Saudi Arabia or Russia. The United States is the largest producer of crude oil in the world. Those parts, those fracking parts that are necessary in order to keep the fracking going, are going to go offline because of the chain disruptions within a few weeks. Now, you remember, the United States, the economy is very dependent on that export. More money than Germany, England, and Japan generate by themselves. Just that will be impacted. So it's going to hit us too. It's going to hit us too. The global uncertainty is accelerating and intensifying based on the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. It's already at a super high point now, and we're not even in the eye of the storm. The Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto Catch-22 coronavirus problem has to do with China's social and economic system, because whereas until now, China could easily lie its way out of a problem, in this case, lying will only make the underlying viral pandemic problem worse as sick people return to work, only to infect even more coworkers, forcing even more businesses to be quarantined. So remember, I talked about black swans for a good couple of years now. For those of you who've been following my work prior to coming on Patreon, I've been talking about the breakout of a black swan. And the real question is becoming, could the outbreak of the virus in China become the real black swan event for the global economy that everyone is in massive denial about? This is something we have to factor in here. Here's the coronavirus forecast rated by JP Morgan's estimates just a few weeks ago. It was published on the 7th of February. Today's the 23rd. They projected in their worst case pessimistic scenarios in 586. We've blown away that number. We're well past 71,000 at this point. We are blowing past the projected exponential rate of growth. The exponential curve is getting blown out. It's shifting into a quadratic, from an exponential curve to a quadratic one. Again, the global supply and demand shock of coronavirus in the electronic, leather, metal products, glass, ceramics, furniture, construction, household appliances, artware and stationery and sporting, paper making and printing, machinery, manufacturing, petrochemical industry, pharmaceutical industry. And by the way, 10 car factories, including Honda, Renault, PSA, General Motors, are all shut down. You have to remember that the GM division of China makes more cars than the GM division in the United States or Europe. So we need to stop the ridiculous flu comparisons. I still hear statements from astrologers stating that, William, look, the flu virus, the annual flu that erupts and changes every year, kills more people than the coronavirus. But if you think the reported death count is accurate, which I don't believe it is, I believe it's a underreported count. 60 million people are locked up. Actually, it's higher. It's more now, like 75 million people are locked up, with infections growing by 50,000 per day. And that's something that does not occur with the seasonal flu virus. So the U.S. Center of Disease Control and Prevention ran a computer model that was run from Los Alamos Labs based on their projections that the coronavirus will reach a culmination of 550,000 cases this spring in Wuhan. That will be the peak of phase 1. And if the probability of containment remains the same, it will reach likely 4.4 million by phase 2 and possibly phase 3. So we could see up to 4 million people based on the current prediction model, a minimum of 550,000 cases, more likely to be closer to 4.4 million. So the outbreak at this moment, based on the computer models, indicate it's almost certainly cannot be contained, and we must prepare for an epidemic. Is this going to be equivalent to the bubonic plague? Probably not, but we're talking anywhere from 550,000 cases to more likely 4.4 million cases. A majority of those cases will be in China. It will be in China. And one of the predictions I posted here is that China is barely producing anything for the world markets. Very soon, the rest of the world will suddenly discover the long supply chains weren't such a good idea as espoused by the globalists. Soon enough, there will be a big scramble to try to fill in the missing pieces of supply chains, but many goods and services are likely to be less available, and soon America and Europe will discover quickly how much their economies depend upon China for everything from shoes to automobiles to furniture to electronics to iPhones, etc. The coming Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto alignment augurs that the world economy will become very different simply because of the coronavirus.
If you'd like to watch more presentations like this on geopolitics, the economy, and world events from an archetypal and mundane astrological perspective, visit Global Transformation Astrology on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/William Stickevers or click the link in the description for twice monthly webinars plus a monthly Ask Me Anything for Gold subscribers.